The first thing I felt was the cold biting through the place where my cloak used to be, and the second thing I felt was the weight of something enormous and wounded pressed against my ribs, breathing in ragged gusts that smelled of iron and pine. Snow was falling into my open mouth. My fingers were buried to the knuckle in fur matted black with blood, and I could not tell anymore whose blood it was, mine or his, because the wound along his flank had opened again the moment I tried to drag him beneath the overhang of rock, and the gash along my forearm where the trap's teeth had caught me when I pried them off his leg had not stopped weeping since dusk. I had given him my cloak first, then the linen shift beneath it, torn into strips to bind the artery at his throat, then the wool of my underdress, wrapped twice around the gash that ran from shoulder to haunch. I was down to my shift and my stubbornness, and the stubbornness was fraying faster than the linen. Somewhere above us, the wind was screaming through the pines like a woman who had lost something she could not name. I pressed my palm flat against the wolf's sternum because I needed to feel his heartbeat more than I needed to feel my own, and when I found it slow, enormous, impossibly steady, I let my forehead fall against the bone ridge above his eye, and I whispered the only prayer I remembered from childhood, the one my mother used to murmur over burn salves and broken ribs. And I did not notice at first that the wolf had opened his eyes and was looking at me like he knew every syllable. Not like an animal, not like a beast. Something worse, something that understood. And that was the moment I knew I had not stumbled onto a dying wolf in the king's forest. I had stumbled onto something that had been waiting for me, or something I had been walking toward my whole life without knowing the road had a name. Before I take you any further into this, let me say something to you directly, because I can already feel you leaning in, and I want you to know I see you there. If you're someone who feels stories a little deeper than most, who gets caught in the throat by the quiet moments more than the loud ones, stay with me tonight. Settle in somewhere warm. And if at any point a line lands in a place you weren't expecting, do me a kindness and tap the like button, leave a comment telling me what your own hands were doing when you heard it, and subscribe so the next one finds you on a night you need it. Now come back with me. Back before the snow, before the trap, before I ever knew that the man who ruled the north had a second skin and a second name. My name is Avara, and in the village that no longer claims me, I was the healer's daughter, which is to say, I was tolerated the way a sharp knife is tolerated useful, until the moment someone cut themselves on me. My mother died when I was 11, in a winter so hard the crows forgot how to fly, and she left me 3 things: a satchel of dried herbs bound in waxed linen, a small wooden token carved with a mark I did not understand, and a sentence pressed into my ear on the last night she was still lucid enough to lie to me. She said, "Listen closely, Ivara. You are not who they think you are, and when the wolf comes, you must not run." I was 11. I thought she was fevered. I thought the wolf was death. I tucked the sentence away behind my ribs the way you tuck a coin into a hem and forget it for a decade, and I went on living the only life a girl like me could live in a village like mine, which meant setting bones and birthing lambs, and pretending not to notice when the elders crossed 2 fingers behind their backs every time I walked past the well. I was 23 the winter the soldiers came, and 23 the winter I learned that the coin in the hem had been waiting the whole time, and 23 the winter I put my palm on a dying wolf's chest and felt my own blood answer his. Kale. I had been Alpha King for 7 years, and a wolf for 29, and in all that time, I had never once been stupid enough to get caught in a human trap in my own forest, which tells you everything you need to know about the state I was in the night I met her. I had been running for 3 days, running from the council chamber where my Uncle Varn had stood at the head of the long iron table and proposed, with the smooth courtesy of a man sliding a blade between ribs, that the king take a pure-blood bride before the next full moon to settle the question of succession once and for all. Running from the faces of my own inner circle, half of whom would not meet my eyes because they all knew what pure blood meant in Varn's mouth. It meant a girl chosen from the old line books. It meant a ceremony older than mercy. It meant I would be chained to a stranger by a law I had inherited the way a man inherits a noose. I had walked out of that chamber without answering. I had shifted in the courtyard in front of every guard, on duty bones cracking, re-knitting, leathers shredding, something no king of the north had done in living memory, and I had run until the stone of the keep was a rumor behind me, and the only language left in my skull was pine and snow, and the thudding of my own four-footed grief. And somewhere in the third night of running, in a stretch of forest I did not recognize because I had never let myself come this far west, I had put my paw down into iron. The trap was old, rust-eaten, not one of mine, one of the poacher traps my rangers had been trying to clear for a year, the teeth bit to the bone. I remember snarling once, from rage more than pain. And then I remember the smell of a human coming toward me through the snow, and I remember thinking, good, let them come, let them try, I will take one more throat with me before I go. Then she knelt down. She did not speak. She did not flinch. She looked at the trap, and she looked at me, and I watched her face do a thing I had not seen a human face do in 29 years. She looked at me with pity that had no fear in it. None. Her hands were already moving. She pried the jaws apart with a strength her thin wrists had no business holding, and when the iron let go of my leg, she caught my weight against her shoulder like she had been built for it, and the first thing I smelled under the blood and the pine was her, and the smell of her went through me like a blade through warm butter, and every part of me that had been king and wolf and weapon for 7 years went very, very still. Mate. The word arrived in my chest the way lightning arrives in a tree. Not a metaphor. Not poetry. A fact. I had heard the old ones speak of it around fires when I was a cub. The way the body knows before the mind accepts. The way the bond drops into a wolf like a stone into a well, and every ripple after is just you learning the shape of the water. I had not believed them. I had been raised by Varn, and Varn believed in line books and ledgers and the cold mathematics of power, and I had become the kind of king who believed in the same things, because believing in anything else got you killed. And now here I was, half dead in the snow, watching a girl with chapped hands and river-gray eyes tear her own cloak into strips for a beast she should have been running from, and the mathematics had gone out the window and taken the king with it. I tried to warn her. I tried to pull away so she would not give me the clothes off her back in a forest where the cold could kill her before dawn. She put her hand flat on my chest and said, quietly, without any tremor at all, Don't what? I wanted to ask. Don't die. Don't move. Don't be what I think you are. She did not clarify. She never clarified. She just kept working, and somewhere in the long hours between midnight and the gray hour before dawn, I stopped being able to keep my eyes open, and the last thing I felt before the dark took me was her forehead against the bone above my eye and a prayer I had not heard since my mother sang it to me as a pup, Ivara. I did not mean to fall asleep next to him. I meant to keep watch. I meant to keep pressure on the throat wound and change the binding on the flank every hour and keep talking so he would know he was not alone, because my mother had taught me that the dying hear longer than they see, and whatever this creature was, he was dying, and I did not want him to go into the dark thinking no one had stayed. But the cold was a clever thief. It took my fingers first, then my knees, then the back of my neck, and somewhere around the hour when the stars begin to look less like stars and more like holes, I curled into the hollow of his great shoulder because his body was still throwing off heat like a banked forge, and I told myself it was only to survive the night. I told myself it was not because the smell of him was the first smell in my entire life that had ever made me feel like I had come home to a house I had never lived in. I told myself a great many things. None of them were true. I woke to sunlight. I woke to the absence of fur. I woke to the feeling of an arm, a human arm, heavy and warm and scarred draped across my waist, and a human chest rising and falling beneath my cheek, and a human heartbeat doing the exact same slow, enormous thing the wolves had done the night before. For one suspended breath, I did not move. I did not breathe. I catalogued, the way my mother had taught me to catalog a wound before touching it. Skin, hot, almost fevered. Breath, even. Pulse at the throat, strong. The wound I had bound at the wolf's throat was a dark seam now on the throat of a man, half healed already, the kind of healing no human body does in a night. His hair was black and tangled with pine needles. His jaw was the kind of jaw you would carve onto the prow of a ship if you wanted the sea to be afraid. My hand went to my sternum without asking permission from the rest of me. I pressed my palm flat against the bone there, the way you press a hand over a wound to keep something from spilling out, and I felt my own heart answer his, beat for beat, not faster, not slower, sinking like two drums that had been tuned to each other in a room I had never been in. And the sentence my mother had whispered to me on her last clear night rose up inside my skull with a clarity it had never had before. You are not who they think you are, and when the wolf comes, you must not run. I did not run. I was, in fact, the furthest thing from running. I was flat against him with my hand on my chest and my mouth gone completely dry. And then his eyes opened, and they were the same eyes. The wolf's eyes. Gold at the center, gray at the rim, and already looking at me like he had found something he had stopped letting himself look for. He did not speak for a long moment. Neither did I. Then he said, in a voice rough from blood loss and something older than blood loss, "You gave me your cloak." "Yes. You gave me your dress. Most of it. You should be dead from the cold. I should." He closed his eyes for one heartbeat, like a man absorbing a blow. When he opened them again, something in them had decided. He said, "What is your name, healer?" "Ivara." He repeated it. "Ivara." One word. Like tasting a thing he had been hungry for without knowing its name. Then he said, "I am Kale, and I am the Alpha King of the North, and I owe you a life." And he paused there, and the pause was the loudest thing I had ever heard, because the end of that sentence was sitting in his throat unsaid, and we both knew what it was, and neither of us had the courage yet to let it into the air between us. Kale. I took her back to the keep wrapped in my own cloak, because she refused to take it until I pointed out, quite reasonably, that I was no longer bleeding and she no longer had a dress. She laughed once at that. A small, dry laugh, cracked at the edges. I will remember that laugh on my deathbed. It was the first time I had heard a woman laugh at me without calculating what the laugh might cost her, and the sound of it did something to the wall I had been building inside my chest for 7 years. It did not break the wall. It just put a single fingertip against one of the stones and found that the mortar had already been crumbling. I carried her the last mile because her legs had begun to shake and she was too proud to say so, and when the gates of the keep opened and the guards saw their king walking out of the snow with a half-naked woman asleep against his shoulder, not one of them was stupid enough to speak. Varn was waiting in the great hall. Of course, Varn was waiting. My uncle had the unerring instinct of every predator who has survived, by knowing which direction the wind will turn. He stood by the central fire with his hands folded behind his back and his silver hair catching the torchlight like a blade, and his eyes went to the girl in my arms and then to my face and then to the girl again, and I watched him do the arithmetic I had been dreading. Her clothes. My cloak. The way I was holding her. The way my body had, without my permission, angled itself between her and him the moment I crossed the threshold. He smiled the smile he used for visiting lords and condemned men. He said, "Nephew, you have brought a guest." I said, "She saved my life. She will be treated as such, and if any mouth in this keep speaks of her without respect, I will hear about it, and I will answer it." And he inclined his head the exact fraction of a degree that meant, "As you wish, my king," and we both knew he had already begun to sharpen something. I took her to the tower room that had been my mother's. I laid her on the bed, and I pulled the furs to her chin, and I stood over her longer than I should have, and I watched the way her lashes lay against her cheek, and the way her mouth had fallen slightly open in sleep, and I thought, I have ruled this kingdom for 7 years on the principle that nothing in it was allowed to be mine, and here in the space of one night, I have found the first thing I refused to give back. I sent for the old healer, Brina, who had raised me after my mother died and who was the only person left in the keep who still told me the truth without softening it. Brina came in on her cane and looked at Ivara for a long time, and then she looked at me, and her face did something I had not seen her face do since the day I was crowned. She went pale. She said, "Boy, where did you find her?" "In the Westwood. Caught in a poacher trap. She gave me her clothes. Brina lowered herself slowly into the chair beside the bed. She reached out one gnarled finger and traced the line of Ivara's jaw, like she was confirming a shape she had last seen 20 years ago. And then she said, "Oh, child. Oh, you stupid, stubborn, beautiful child. She has been hidden a long time." I said, "Hidden from what?" Brina looked up at me, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "From your uncle. From the pack registers. From the ceremony he wants to hold on the next full moon. She is the last daughter of Ashreach, the pack your uncle had burned to the ground the winter before your coronation, and if he learns who she is before you claim her in open hall, he will have her dead before the moon is full." I did not move. I did not breathe. Inside my chest, the wolf who had been lying very quietly since I woke up with her hand on my sternum, lifted his head and bared every tooth he owned. Ivara. I woke in a room made of stone and firelight, and for a long, disoriented moment, I thought I had died and been given a kinder afterlife than I deserved. There were furs on the bed that smelled of cedar. There was a fire in a hearth the size of a small cottage. There was a gray-haired woman sitting beside me, with a bowl of broth in her lap and an expression on her face that I recognized from my mother's face the night she told me I was not who the village thought I was. The woman saw my eyes open and she said, softly, "Drink first, questions after," and she held the bowl to my mouth and I drank, because I had learned long ago that you do not argue with women who have that expression. When the bowl was empty, she set it aside and took both of my hands in hers and turned them palm up the way you would read an old map, and she made a small sound in the back of her throat that was part grief and part recognition and part something that might have been triumph. She said, "Do you know what you are, girl?" I said, "The healer's daughter." She said, "Yes." And I said, "I don't know what you mean." She said, "Your mother's name was Isolde of Ashreach, wasn't it?" My breath left me all at once. No one in the village had spoken my mother's name in 12 years. The elders had agreed, after she died, that she had been a woman who brought trouble, and the cure for trouble was to forget the name that carried it. I had not heard Isolde spoken aloud since the night I sat beside her body and promised her I would remember for both of us. I said, "How do you know that?" "Brina," she told me her name was Brina, smiled, a smile that had a crack through the middle of it, and she said, "Because I was the one who hid her, child. I was the one who carried her out of the burning Ashreach compound the night Varn's wolves came through the gate and put every elder in that pack to the sword, and I set her on a cart going south with a satchel of herbs and a wooden token, and I told her to go somewhere no one would think to look for the last daughter of a destroyed pack. And she went, and she did what I told her, and she had you, and now here you are back in the keep that was supposed to be your aunt's, wearing the king's cloak, with his teeth marks on your shoulder from carrying you, and the old gods have a sense of humor I am too old to appreciate." I could not speak. I sat there with my hands in hers, and I felt the whole architecture of the life I thought I had been living begin to rearrange itself around a truth I had never been told. My mother had not been a village healer. My mother had been a hidden thing. The token my mother had left me was the sigil of Ashreach. The sentence behind my ribs, "You are not who they think you are," had been an inheritance, not a fever dream. And the wolf in the forest had not been an accident. Brina watched my face do all of this, and she waited, patient as stone, and when I could finally find my voice, I said, "The man who carried me here." She said, "KL, the Alpha King. Yes. Is he?" "Yes." "Is he also?" "Yes." "Am I?" Brina squeezed my hands. She said, "You are the last daughter of a pack your Uncle Varn has spent 30 years pretending was a rumor, child, and he means to hold a ceremony on the next full moon. It will bind Kael to a girl of Varn's choosing and close the door on Ashreach forever. If he finds you here before Kael names you Luna in open hall, you will not see another sunrise." I heard myself say, quite calmly, "Then we should probably not let him find me." Brina laughed once, the same cracked laugh I had laughed in the snow, and she said, "Oh, you are your mother's daughter." And then the door opened and Kale was standing in it, and the look on his face when his eyes found mine across the room was the look of a man who had been walking a long time toward a fire he was only now letting himself feel. Kale. For 3 days I did not touch her. I want you to understand what that cost me. I walked past her door 100 times a day and did not go in. I sat across from her at the long table at supper and did not let my knee touch hers. I listened to her voice in the corridors. She had already started helping Brina in the infirmary, because of course she had, because a woman like that does not know how to sit still while people are bleeding, and every time I heard her laugh at something, one of the wounded guardsmen said, the wolf inside me turned a slow circle and lay back down with his chin on his paws and waited. Because I had made a decision, and the decision was this. I would not claim her in secret. I would not take her to my bed in the dark and give Varn the weapon of calling her a kept woman. I would name her Luna in open hall, in daylight, in front of every lord and captain of the north, with her hand in mine and the mark of Ashreach spoken aloud, and I would do it before the next full moon, so that the ceremony Varn had planned would have nothing left to bind. But I could not do it without her consent, and consent in a room like mine is a difficult thing, because the girl you are asking has just learned she is the last of a burned pack, and the man asking is the king who could protect her, and I refused to let her say yes, because she was afraid of saying no. So I waited. I let her rest. I let Brina tell her the rest of the story in pieces small enough to swallow. And on the 3rd night, I went to the tower room and I knocked, and she opened the door in a borrowed green dress with her hair still damp from the bath, and the firelight behind her carved a shape around her that I will see behind my eyelids the day I die. I said, walk with me. She said, where? I said, the battlements. I need to tell you something, and I need the sky for it. She came. We walked the long curve of the north wall, with the wind pulling at her hair and the torches spitting in their brackets, and when we reached the place where the wall turns toward the sea, I stopped, and I turned to face her and I said, Ivara, I am going to tell you a thing. And after I tell you, I am going to walk back down those stairs and leave you alone with it. And whatever you decide I will honor, on my name and on my wolf. She waited. I said, you are my mate, the bond that drops into a wolf once in his life, if he is lucky, and never if he is not. I felt it the moment you put your hand on my chest in the snow. I have felt it every moment since. It is not a metaphor. It is not poetry. It is a fact my body knew before my mind would let it through the door. My wolf recognized you before I did, and I am telling you because you deserve to know what is standing in front of you before you decide whether to let it stay. Her hand went to her sternum. I had noticed she did that, pressed her palm flat over her heart the way a woman presses a hand over a wound. She did it now, and she did not look away from me, and she said, quietly, I have felt it too. I thought I was losing my mind. I said, you are not. She said, KL. Just the name. One word. The way the old ones said it, back when naming a thing was the same as taking it into your keeping. I did not move. I had promised myself I would not move. She closed the distance between us herself, and she put her free hand flat against my chest over the place the wound had been, and she said, tell me what claiming means. I told her. I told her everything. The hall. The witnesses. The old words spoken over joined hands. The Luna's mark placed at the throat by the Alpha's own hand. Given and received by choice, never taken. The fact that once it is done, it cannot be undone. Not by Varn, not by law, not by death. I told her she could say no. I told her she could take a horse at dawn and I would give her an escort and gold and a new name and a farm in the southern valleys where no one had ever heard of Ashreach. I told her I would let her go, and I meant it. And the wolf inside me whimpered once and went silent. She listened. When I was done, she tilted her face up to mine. The wind had brought a strand of hair across her mouth, and I wanted to move it, and I did not let myself. And she said, I have spent my whole life being told I was trouble for being born. I have spent my whole life pressing a sentence behind my ribs because I did not understand what it meant. Tonight, I understand it. And I am not running, Kale. Name me Luna in your hall. In daylight. In front of all of them. Let your uncle see. I closed my eyes. I think I said her name. I think I said it 3 times. And then I took her hand, just her hand. Just the hand. Because I had promised, and I walked her back down the stairs. And we did not kiss. Because the almost of it, the held breath of it, was the most honest thing either of us had ever given anyone, and neither of us was going to cheapen it by spending it in a corridor. Ivara. He kissed me the next morning. I want the record to show that. He kissed me in the gray hour before dawn on the threshold of the infirmary, where I had gone to help Brina change the dressings on a boy who had taken an arrow in the thigh, and KL had come to find me because word had reached him that a rider had come in from the west with news that could not wait. He stopped me in the doorway with one hand flat against the frame above my head, and he looked at me for one long breath, and then he said, "Forgive me. I cannot walk into that room without doing this first," and he bent his head and put his mouth on mine. It was not a soft kiss. It was not a careful one. It was the kiss of a man who had been holding a door shut for 3 days against a flood, and the door had finally given, and the flood was quiet only because it was so deep. I felt his hand come up to the back of my neck, and I felt my own hands fist in the front of his tunic, and I felt the wolf in him and the thing in me that answered the wolf lean toward each other across a distance neither of us had words for, and when he finally pulled back, his forehead was against mine, and his breath was uneven, and he said, 3 days later, and I am undone. And I laughed, the same cracked laugh, the one Brina said belonged to my mother, and I said, "Alpha, King of the North. You are worse at waiting than you think." And he said, "I know." And then we went into the infirmary, and we did not speak of it again until nightfall, because the rider from the west had brought news, and the news was this. Varn had moved the ceremony forward. Not the next full moon. Tomorrow night. He had sent summons to every lord within 2 days' ride, and he had chosen his pure-blood bride from the old line books, and the girl was on the road already, and the trap was not for me, because Varn did not yet know I existed, but the trap was closing all the same, and if Kael stood in that hall tomorrow night without a Luna already named, he would be bound for him. We stood in the war room with the map spread out and the captains silent around us, and Kael's second, a black-bearded giant named Torin who had not said 3 words to me since I arrived but who had, I noticed, begun standing very slightly between me and any door Varn might come through, finally spoke. He said, "My king, if we do it tonight, in the hall, with the lords who are already here, we can present it as fact before Varn's girl arrives. The old words will hold. The bond will hold. He cannot undo a Luna named in open hall." Kael looked at me. Only at me. He said, "Ivara, it is your choice. It has always been your choice. I will not do this to you. I will do it with you, or I will not do it at all. And if you want another hour to think, I will burn the next hour myself." I thought about my mother. I thought about the cart going south in the dark with a satchel and a token. I thought about every year I had spent being tolerated like a sharp knife, and every year I had spent pressing a sentence behind my ribs without understanding it. I thought about the wolf in the snow, and the weight of him against my chest, and the prayer I had said without knowing, I still knew it. I reached across the map, and I took Kael's hand in both of mine, and I said, "Tonight, in the hall, in front of all of them. And bring Brina, because I want the woman who carried my mother out of the fire to stand where my mother should have stood." Kael lifted my hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to the inside of my wrist, and every wolf in the room, and there were more wolves in that room than I had realized, lowered their heads a single inch, which I would learn later was the oldest gesture of allegiance their kind had. Torin cleared his throat. He said, "Luna." It was the first time anyone had called me Luna in my entire life, and the word did something to the inside of my chest I was not prepared for, and I had to press my palm flat over my sternum to keep it from spilling, and Kael saw me do it. And Kael smiled, really smiled, for the first time since the snow, and the smile was a small, broken, beautiful thing, and I decided in that moment that I would spend whatever years I had left trying to put it on his face as often as I could. Kael. The great hall of the keep is a long room with a floor of black stone and a ceiling lost in smoke. And when I walked into it that night with Ivara's hand in mine, I felt every torch along the walls become a witness. The lords were already seated. Varn was already at the head of the lower table, in the chair he had occupied for 7 years under the polite fiction that it was not the chair of a regent. He rose when he saw me. He rose faster when he saw her. I watched his face do the thing faces do when a man who has calculated every variable discovers there is a variable he did not know existed, and I let him look, and I let the silence in the hall stretch until it was tight enough to play music on. Then, I said, in the voice I used only for things I would not take back, Lords of the North, you were summoned here tomorrow for a ceremony. I have brought the ceremony forward by 1 night, and I have brought you a Luna you were not expecting. I walked Ivara to the center of the hall, under the great iron wheel of candles, and I turned her to face me, and Brina came forward on her cane and stood at her shoulder where her mother should have stood, and I saw Varn's eyes go to Brina, and I saw him begin, finally, to understand. I said, her name is Ivara, daughter of Isolde, last blood of Ashreach. The pack this council was told had been lost to a winter fire. It was not a fire. It was my uncle. And this woman is the proof of it. I say in open hall and before all of you that she is my mate by the old bond, felt and answered, and I ask her here, where everyone can hear her, whether she chooses me in return, because I will not have it said that a king of the north took anything that was not given. I turned her hand palm up, and I laid mine over it. I said, Ivara, do you choose this? She did not hesitate. She said yes. 1 word. The way the old ones said it. And then, because she was who she was, she added, dryly, loud enough for the back of the hall to hear, and if anyone here has a problem with that, I have spent the last 3 days in the infirmary, and I know exactly how much it hurts to get a needle through the webbing between your fingers, and I am happy to demonstrate. A sound went through the hall that in any other room would have been laughter, and in that room was something closer to a vow. Torin, at the edge of my vision, pressed a fist to his chest. Brina was openly weeping. I drew Ivara against me, and I set my thumb at the hollow of her throat, and I spoke the old words, the ones my mother had taught me before she died, the ones no king of the north had spoken over a willing Luna in 3 generations, and I placed the Luna's mark at the hollow of her throat with my own hand, not taken, given, the way the old bond demands. The mark rose under my palm as I spoke, silver and slow, the way dawn comes. She gasped once. Then she laughed. That cracked, beautiful laugh, and she turned her face into my shoulder for 1 heartbeat, and when she lifted her head again she was Luna of the North in every line of her, and the hall erupted. Varn did not erupt. Varn stood very still at the head of the lower table, and then he said, in a voice like a blade being drawn slowly, Nephew, this is a violation of the line books. This girl has no standing. This claiming is not valid. I turned to look at him. I did not let go of her. I said, Uncle, the claiming is done. The bond is witnessed. Ashreach is not a rumor. And if you raise 1 more word against the Luna standing beside me in this hall, I will answer it not as a king but as a wolf. And you have never seen me answer anything as a wolf, and you will not enjoy the lesson. Varn looked at the faces around him. He looked for allies. He found, I think for the first time in his life, that he did not have as many as he had believed. He inclined his head the exact fraction of a degree that meant, as you wish, my king. And I knew, Ivara knew. I felt her fingers tighten in mine that the fight was not over, that Varn would go to his rooms tonight and begin sharpening something else, that tomorrow would bring a new kind of trouble. But tonight the hall was ours, and the mark at her throat was still warm under my palm, and the woman beside me was laughing with tears on her face, and Brina was pressing a kiss to her forehead, and the lords of the north were coming forward 1 by 1 to kneel to a Luna they had not known they had yesterday. And for the first time in 7 years, I let the wall inside my chest come the rest of the way down, and I stood there in the center of my own hall with my mate in my arms, and I was undone, and I was finally, at home. Ivara, Varn tried to have me killed 4 days later, which surprised no one, least of all me. He sent 2 men into the tower room in the hour before dawn, with soft boots and long knives, and they found, instead of a sleeping girl, a black wolf the size of a pony sitting on the hearthrug with his head on his paws and his eyes already open. Because Kale had not slept in the tower room at my side since the claiming without one ear turned toward the door, and because the bond, it turned out, meant that I had felt the intent of the men on the stairs the moment it crossed the threshold of the corridor, and I had put my hand on Kale's shoulder, and he had been between me and the door before the first boot touched the top step. He did not kill them. He wanted to. I felt him want to, the way you feel a fire want to eat a room, but I put my palm flat against his flank, the same place I had bandaged in the snow, and I said, "Alive. Love. We need them alive." And he made a sound in his throat that was half snarl and half surrender, and he pinned them to the stones instead, one under each massive paw, and Torin came up the stairs with 6 guards and took them away to a room with no windows, and by noon we knew exactly whose hand had sent them, and by sundown Varn was in chains in his own chambers, awaiting the judgment of the council he had spent 30 years running. The council was swift. The council had been waiting, it turned out, a very long time to be swift about Varn. By the end of the week, he was exiled to a holding on the far northern coast, where the sea was cold enough to teach a man humility, and his pure-blood bride had been sent home with an honor gift and a letter of apology, and the keep was quieter than it had been in a generation. And I was standing in the infirmary at dusk, rebandaging the leg of the same boy who had taken the arrow in the thigh, and I was laughing at something Brina had said, and I realized, with a kind of slow astonishment, that I was happy. Not the sharp, bright happy of rescue. The other kind. The quiet kind. The kind that settles into the bones and makes a home there. Kale came to find me at full dark, as he did every night now, and he leaned in the doorway of the infirmary, the way he had leaned the morning he first kissed me, and he watched me finish the bandage without interrupting, and when I was done he said, "Come upstairs with me, Luna," and I went. Our rooms, a phrase I was still learning the taste of, were at the top of the south tower, where the windows looked toward the forest I had been found in. There was a fire. There was a rug made of the pelt of a bear Kael had killed the first winter of his reign, which I had told him was gruesome, and which he had told me, quite seriously, was sentimental. There was a low table, with bread and cheese, and the dark red wine of the southern valleys, and there was the great bed under the window where we had, after the claiming, spent 3 nights learning each other with the patience of people who had all the time in the world because the world had finally stopped trying to take it from them. Kale poured the wine. He handed me a cup. He sat down on the bearskin rug in front of the fire and he held out his hand to me, and I sat down between his knees with my back against his chest and his arms around me and his chin on the top of my head, and we watched the fire for a long time without speaking, because we had learned, both of us, that there was a kind of silence between 2 people that was louder than any declaration, and we were in no hurry to fill it. After a while, he said, "Against my hair, Brina wants to teach you the old prayers, the ones your mother would have taught you." I said, "I would like that." He said, "Torin wants to teach you the knife." I said, "I would like that more." He laughed, an actual laugh, a rumble I felt in my spine, and he said, "Of course you would." I tilted my head back against his shoulder and I looked up at him, and the firelight was carving shadows on his face the way it had carved them on the wolf's, and I thought, the body knew. The body knew before the mind accepted. The body always knows. I said, "Kale." He said, I said, "The night you were caught in the trap. What were you running from?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "A life in which no one had ever looked at me the way you looked at me in the snow." I said, "And now," he said, "now I am running toward the rest of it." I pressed my palm flat against my sternum, the old gesture, the one I had done 1,000 times in a village where I had never belonged. This time I did not do it to keep something from spilling out. I did it to feel my heart and his heart doing the slow, enormous sinking thing they had been doing since the snow, and to notice, finally, that I was no longer afraid of what my chest contained. I was its keeper. I was its home. And so was he. Outside, somewhere in the forest, a wolf was calling, and another was answering, and the answer was not lonely. So that is the story. That is how a girl with a borrowed name and a cloak full of blood walked into the king's forest with a satchel of herbs, and walked out with a mate, a mark, a mother's name spoken aloud again at last, and a fire to sit in front of on the coldest nights of the year. If you made it all the way here with me, thank you. Truly. I know your time is the most honest thing you own, and you spent some of it on us tonight, and I do not take that lightly. Before you go, tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you. Was it her palm on his chest in the snow? Was it the almost kiss on the battlements that neither of them spent cheaply? Was it the Luna's mark placed in the Great Hall? Or Brina weeping? Or the dry joke about the needle between the fingers? Or the quiet